Hey there, welcome once again to another installment of Strange Planet, and it is a far stranger planet than we can possibly comprehend. And if you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. And also, if you're listening to the audio podcast on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're listening, be sure to give us a 5-star review and leave a few comments. It helps with the algorithms and it helps spread the word. All right, on this episode, we're going to trace the fault lines running through the world's oldest dynasty and into the darkest corners of global power. Geoffrey Gilson isn't just another commentator. He's a former speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher who spent decades following the money, the intelligence ties, and the personal entanglements that bind governments, financiers, and royals alike. He's back to join us to expose how the Epstein network and the British monarchy intersect in ways the establishment refuses to confront, from Prince Andrew's dubious alliances to Sarah Ferguson's inexplicable financial lifelines. And as reports swirl about King Charles III's declining health, Geoffrey examines what that means for Prince William's sudden prominence and the whisper campaign claiming the king's private faith isn't what it seems. This isn't gossip, it's the anatomy of influence, a glimpse into how scandal, succession, and secret loyalties are used to steer the course of nations. Geoffrey Gilson, welcome once again to Strange Planet. How are you?
I'm fine, Richard. Thank you for having me back. Happy to be talking about this.
So you've mapped the hidden networks behind the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. We've talked about it on this podcast, the Russian saga. How does the involvement of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson fit into that pattern of elite power exchange and cover-ups?
Well, it's very interesting. I like the expression you used, Richard, anatomy of loyalty, because that's what's preeminent here. And before any viewers or listeners decide to turn off and go watch another installment of The Crown, this program is where it's going to be happening. You might think, and a lot of people are saying, that the Prince Andrew saga, Sarah Ferguson, Epstein is a distraction. It is not a distraction. As you quite rightly pointed out, the royal family is one of the oldest dynasty, oldest global networks in the world. And what is happening between Andrew and Epstein, and by the end of this program, I hope to have made this clear, is not a distraction from what's going on in the world. It is emblematic of the powers and the sociopathy that is breaking our world. Whether you're looking at the assassination of Charlie Kirk or what's happening in the Ukraine and Israel, it is all connected. And another point to make is that when you look at this, say, I know that, because behind Prince Andrew is X. No, there's X and Y and Z. There's various levels. And an expression I'm probably going to use a lot in this particular program is rubbernecking. And we know what that means. You pass the car wreck, you promise yourself you're not going to look, but you do. And what you see immediately is awful. There's a story behind it, but behind that story may be another story. And to truly understand the royal family, Andrew and Epstein, you have to look at all the various levels that are going on. Now, I'm going to get to Andrew and Epstein, but if you don't mind, I'm going to deal with them in the second half of the program rather than the first, for two reasons. I can be very honest, Richard. First, because talking about the other matters that you raised, King Charles rather, and Prince William and the Muslim saga and so on, helps to set the scene for Andrew, but also because Andrew and Epstein is the important thing. And if I give it all away at the beginning, they'll go off. So we're going to make them wait to the end of the program. So
right.
first of all, listen, a quick history lesson. And it may seem irrelevant. It's not. It sets the scene. And I'm looking down at my notes here, not because I'm stupid, but because it's kind of complicated.
Right.
And I want to get this right. Cast your minds back, everyone, to about the 1400s, 1500s in Europe. Britain wasn't preeminent. We were a minor, very minor nation. Then Elizabeth I beat the Spanish Armada. The Spains and the Portuguese at that time were the preeminent powers in Europe. They were the ones who were exploring the New World, settling Latin America, creating colonies around the world. Britain was second, third rate. But somehow Elizabeth managed to gather together her team of pirates and buccaneers and Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. We've probably seen the movies. And she defeated the Spanish Armada. And overnight, Great Britain became a power in Europe. We then became one of the leading colonists around the world. Let's leave the politics out of it. One of the leading colonies. We had the Americas. We set up colonies in Africa, India, China, Australia. At one stage, 1/3 of the world was ruled under the flag of the British monarchy. The empire then probably received its height at the end of the 19th century when Victoria was queen and the city of London was preeminent. Think Jack Sparrow, Pirates of the Caribbean, the East India Company. That's what made up the city of London. There were financial companies, there were private companies, perhaps chartered by the royals, that were at the forefront of creating the empire, to bringing raw materials back to Great Britain, trading, the slave triangle across the Atlantic, and so on. All of the empires collapsed in the First World War. And from that point, for the next 100 years, the seeming power of Great Britain seemed to have dwindled, but not the City of London and not the monarchy, because all of the networks that were created by the monarchy during the empire persisted. As far as the City of London is concerned, all of the financial networks persisted. The City of London is not just one of the preeminent financial centers in the world today, it is the preeminent covert financial center of the world. You want to stage a coup, you go to the City of London. You want to find mercenaries, you go to the City of London. You want to traffic children or drugs, you go to the City of London and you talk to someone sounding like me, looking like me, nicely dressed like me, but they're as corrupt as any mafia don in The Sopranos. And that's where the power of the monarchy in Great Britain still resides. There is another network that's very important. And you know, Richard, I'm surprised it hasn't been mentioned more, and that is Freemasons. Freemasonry began in France, I think, in the late 18th century, but quickly translated to Great Britain. And Freemasonry in Great Britain then found its way across the Atlantic, as we all know, the symbology in the dollar bill and so on. But the royal family was closely allied with Freemasonry. We have something called the Grand United England Lodge, which is the primary English lodge and one of the primary lodges around the world through its offshoots. And royals are almost always the Grand Masters. A man called the Duke of Kent, who is the Queen's cousin, is the current Grand Master. Prince Michael of Kent is very important in the Freemasons. So too are all of the younger royals. They are senior officers in Freemasonry. And that is something that most of the mainstream press has missed. And I talked about the layers of secrecy and the layers of networks. That is a very important layer that people miss out. And allied to it, and you'll find it in my book, we haven't mentioned it, we'll mention it now, my book, Maggie's Hammer. All of these networks became turbocharged in the 80s for reasons which are explained in the book. We've talked about it before, don't necessarily need to speak about it now, but they all became turbocharged. Intelligence, military, government, private contractors, all became turbocharged in the 80s, made a lot of money, re-emphasized the networks, which were again re-emphasized during the war on terror in the North. Hugely powerful now, as I said. They affect everything from Ukraine to Russiagate to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Freemasons were part of it. There is an attendant point, which actually could be a whole different program, which is the chivalric orders in Europe. Knights of Malta, Knights of St. John, Knights of Lazarus. Your listeners and viewers may say, what on earth has this got to do with anything? It has everything to do if you study the fall of communism in the 80s. My primary British intelligence informant, when I first spoke to him, was just talking about British intelligence matters. Then when I was talking to him in November of 1989, rather exciting, I had to speak to him at night, at midnight, from a telephone kiosk in a railway station in rural England, so I wouldn't be seen or heard, and I had to balance a microphone in my ear to get to record him. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. All of a sudden, he was talking a completely different story. He was talking about a war that had been fought for 1,000 years. And I corrected him and said, well, the Cold War has been fought for 70 years. He said, if you and others do not look at Europe, or rather, if you do look at Europe, and all you see are intelligence agencies and governments, you're missing various layers of power. These chivalric orders, and he was a Knight of Lazarus, are much more important in what's going to happen in Central and Eastern Europe think Ukraine than people actually realize. Whole different layer of network. And again, the royals very, very involved at the head of a number of chivalry orders.
Now,
So all
sorry to interrupt, Jeffrey. And I know, as you say, this is a huge topic. We could dedicate an entire episode, and I've done
yes,
countless shows on the Masonic lodges and so forth.
yes.
But so, how do they influence the royal family, and where do they derive their power from?
Well, the Masonic Freemasonry derived. I don't know exactly where they were a secret society. They come from the Knights Templar and so on. All of these networks overlap and attach to each other. Every time you get a new network, it comes across the other networks, and they literally marry. The royals adopted Freemasonry and then became its leaders. And in terms of Freemasonry in Great Britain and their affiliates around the world, the royal family are seen as very senior Masons. Now, you know about the rituals of Freemasonry and how secret deals can be done and so on. The same thing with the chivalry orders. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but what it highlights is the fact that behind the organization of these networks is something personal. And the important thing to understand about the royal family, whether they are Masons or chivalry order members or just ordinary people, their power comes from their personality. And that is, in America, people talk about the loyalty to the Constitution. We don't have a Constitution in Great Britain. What you talk about in Great Britain is loyalty to the Crown as a person. The Crown owns the land. The government in Parliament is described as the Crown's ministers in Parliament. We've been hearing how Andrew has lost his royal titles. They may have to be removed by an Act of Parliament. There is agonized negotiation between Keir Starmer's office and the royal family at the moment, because Parliament, by tradition, does not interfere in the affairs of the royal family. This becomes very important later on in the program, because the intelligence services and the military, particularly, if you talk to them, do not owe their fealty to the government or to Parliament. They owe their fealty personally to the Crown. And if ever there is a conflict between the Crown and the government, the Crown comes first. And this is very important for just explaining why Prince Andrew has been getting away with this, because he is an important person, even though he is a second royal. Example of it, yes.
Well, I was just going to say, okay, you finish your thought, and then I want to, talking about the association with all of these Masonic orders, Freemasonry, which is to me antithetical to Christianity, and yet we have the head of the king, King Charles III, is the head of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England.
Yes.
He is the protector of the faith. So,
yes.
But anyway, finish your thought, and then I want to come around to that.
Okay. Edward VIII, who abdicated his throne, huge upset. The upset wasn't that he abdicated his throne or that he was going to marry an American. The upset was that the royalty has certain powers as far as governance is concerned. It is also, in its own right, the most important aristocratic family in Great Britain. It has its own wealth. It's worth $6 billion. That is property of the royal family, the House of Windsor. If you were to remove the monarchy, they would walk off with $6 billion, pounds rather. They own Windsor Castle, they own Sandringham, they own Balmoral. Windsor Castle would become the House of Windsor. It wouldn't be given back to the nation. It doesn't belong to the nation. When Edward VIII abdicated, he had already accepted the throne. I don't know that he was coronated, but he had accepted the throne. And at the point that he abdicated, since he had taken on the throne and become the king, all the money had passed to him, all the lands had passed to him, all the titles had passed to him, and Richard, all of the secrets had passed to him. So when he abdicated, they couldn't just take it back. They had to negotiate that with him. Now, the subject matter of my book, Maggie's Hammer, lots of interesting connections here. My mentor, the guy who turned up dead in the woods, I got to get this right. He was the executor for the senior partner of his law firm. That senior partner was the executor for the solicitor who acted for Edward VIII in his abdication. So my mentor, Hugh Simmons, was sworn into all of the secrets so that he would be able to perform his duties. He wasn't able to tell me very much, but what he said was it was ugly because all of these secrets and all this wealth resided with Edward VIII, and they had to get it back through threat and excommunication and exiling. The Crown is a very interesting program. The Crown wouldn't appear if the royal family didn't agree. So a lot of what you see in The Crown is not actually true. They treated Edward VIII appallingly because they had to regain control of the personal secrets. That's the power of the royal family. What they have garnered over hundreds of years of being part of, being the head of an empire, head of the Freemasons, that's the element of their power. Now, I'm trying to remember what your question was, but I know you'll remind me.
All right. So, again, King Charles III, as head of the Church of England, defender of the Christian faith, very important position. And yet, there are unverified rumors that he converted to Islam. In fact, we've seen, if he hasn't converted, he certainly outwardly has a very strong fascination, affinity for Islam. What is it? Are those rumors true?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the networks. The British are past masters at absorbing. If you become rich and you're not part of the establishment, you're not a royal, you're not a noble, they will absorb you. They've absorbed Elton John. Elton John is great, our friends with King Charles now. They've absorbed Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger, there's a very famous hotel in London called Brown's. They're very strong on dress code. Mick Jagger is the only person in the world who is allowed to walk into Brown's wearing jeans because he's Mick Jagger. They absorb and they cross over. So Charles has absolutely no problem with being both a Freemason and the head of the Church of England because they find a way to adapt and to accommodate. That's part of all these power networks. The most extraordinary things and sometimes the most revolting things can exist side by side. As far as the Muslim rumors are concerned, here's the situation. Prince Charles is a very sensitive man. He's kind of left-wing, happier with a Tony Blair than he is with a Margaret Thatcher. And 11% of the population in Great Britain is Muslim. We've had a long-standing Muslim community in Great Britain, but it has particularly enlarged with all of the exodus from Syria, Afghanistan, and some of the North African countries. But 11% of our nation is Muslim. That is almost the size of the black population in America. So imagine walking down the street into Walmart or whatever and seeing as many Muslims as you do blacks. That is the presence of Muslims in Great Britain. Charles takes that seriously. They are a part of his nation, and he is close to them, and he meets with Muslim leaders and so on. I have to say, I have not come across any indication that he has converted to Muslim. But since you've brought it up, it raises another interesting angle on, leading up, we will get to Prince Andrew and Epstein, about how these networks work. Because the fear was not that Charles had become Muslim, the fear was that Diana was going to become Muslim. Now again, don't pay attention to what happened in The Crown. What The Crown said about Diana and Dodi marrying is not true. They were going to get married. Got a few connections of my own. I know a guy called Mark Saunders, who is Diana's leading paparazzi. Lovely guy until he gets behind a camera, Richard. Then he becomes a monster. But if you have seen a video of Diana walking through Malaga Airport with a photographer 2 feet in front of her walking backwards, that was Mark. That's how he made his living. He was very close to Diana. Interesting thing about Diana, not as sweet as people make out. And she had, how can I put this nicely, affairs with her photographers. I didn't believe this. Mark gave me her private telephone number and said, how do I have that? Diana was very sure of herself. She pushed aside her sister when she was 16 and made a beeline for Prince Charles. She wanted to marry him. She wanted to be Queen of England. She got a very good settlement in marriage. But the fear was that she was going to marry Dodi, which she was, and the fear was that she was going to convert to Islam. which is also true. Now, picture in your mind, Prince William becomes king, Elizabeth is gone, Charles is gone, Andrew's sidelined, Edward is no longer important, all their siblings and cousins no longer matter, Anne doesn't matter, it's William, Harry's off in America, and if Diana had still been alive, it would no longer have been the House of Windsor, it would have been the House of Diana, a woman whose husband and William's stepfather were Muslim. Now, does that mean that the royal family killed Diana? No. Was Diana in an accident? Not according to my sources, and it's in Maggie's hammer. Was she the target? No. Dodi was the target. Dodi was the target because when I get to Prince Andrew and Epstein, what I'm going to talk about is arms dealing and money laundering, because that's a network below all of this, which is actually the powerful network. Dodi was targeted because his father was going to talk about arms deals that Great Britain had been doing with the Middle East secretly. And they needed to make a point. And the point was, we've killed your son, the collateral damage was Princess Diana, and we don't care. That's how powerful we are. But that's where these networks overlap, and that's the only incidence of a Muslim possibly being in the royal family, but not Prince Charles.
So they wouldn't countenance the Queen Mother if Princess Diana had become the mother of the King William. They wouldn't allow for that, the Queen Mother, to be a Muslim, but they have no problem with King Charles, I don't know, let's say, cozying up to Islam?
Well, actually, and this is the point, I think that you would have found that the networks are so powerful, they accommodate each other. They would, with Charles and Elizabeth gone, and the king being William, they would simply have accommodated the fact that Diana and Dodi were Muslims. You would not have found William becoming a Muslim, but they would have accommodated that fact in a land where 11% of the population is Muslim. That doesn't denigrate the problem with radical Muslims in Great Britain. It is far worse than it is in the United States, but they would have accommodated. I don't think that Prince Charles is cozying up to Islam only because, in my opinion, and from my sources, because there are that many Muslims in Great Britain.
All right, so let's get back to Prince Andrew and his relationship with Epstein, which has been, exhaustively documented. But in your view, is his role more than just an errant prince tangled in a sex scandal? I mean, is he part of a mechanism?
Yes, he is. That's the short answer. Yes, he is. And one of the there is a well-known British politician. It won't mean anything to you, but I'm only going to use him because he said it, and it was interesting. There's a gentleman called Rory Stewart, and he was on a show called BBC Question Time about a week or two ago, and he said, I don't understand your fascination with the whole Andrew Epstein thing. It's a distraction. And the audience went wild, and he was stunned. Rory Stewart is your classic upper-class British person. He happens to be kind of left of centre. It doesn't make any difference. What comes before politics is the network of royalty and aristocracy and upper class. And he was stunned because he did not believe that it was important. Even someone as clued in as him was missing the importance of the networks that engaged Andrew to Epstein. Let's first of all talk about Andrew. One of the first things to understand about Andrew within the anatomy, I like the expression to use, the anatomy of networks in Great Britain, is that Andrew was a second son. In America, that doesn't count for much. In Great Britain, it's everything. Now, you say, but Elizabeth became queen. Yes, because George VI had no sons. In that case, Margaret was the second daughter. Look at all the trouble Margaret got into. Look at the trouble Andrew got into. Look at the trouble Harry is getting into. If you are the second son or the second daughter in British aristocracy, and particularly the royalty, you get nothing. You don't get the land, you get a few titles, you don't get much money. Andrew was living on about £15,000 to £20,000 a year, which was his Navy pension. So from the get-go, he was looking for money. Interesting that he would have married Sarah Ferguson, who had no money. He married Sarah Ferguson because she was a firecracker, like Meghan Markle. But from the get-go, he was looking for money. And essentially what he did was he traded his title and his connections in Freemasonry and in British intelligence members of the royal family are involved with British intelligence. Prince Michael of Kent, again, getting back to my book, Maggie's Hammer, which, and as it describes Hugh Simmons and what happened to him and death and the networks and so on. We've dealt with that before. Hugh would tell me that as he came back late in the evening, we'd stop off and have a drink at my apartment, that evening he'd been sat at the MI6 desk with Prince Michael. And they were mates and they did British intelligence together. So that's what Prince Andrew traded for money. Epstein...
That's treason. That's treason.
Oh, well, it is treason, but it's also, once again, it's this great British establishment accommodation. If you are a part of the network, if you're part of the establishment, you can get away with anything. And that's the deal. We, the royal family, aren't going to give you any money, but we'll kind of turn a blind eye to what you do about money. And then it all got messy with Epstein. But that's what happened. Now, Epstein, most people's story with Epstein starts in New York. Now, the story with Epstein, once again, began in the 80s. Again, my book, Maggie's Hammer, Networks, turbocharged in London in the 80s, arms dealing, money laundering. Epstein came over from New York, a man much the same age as Charles. And there were revelations in 2019 that he had met up with arms dealers and money launderers in Great Britain. I've checked. I can see no connection between Hugh Simmons and Jeffrey Epstein. But what they were doing, particularly through this Israeli intelligence operative, Ari Ben-Menashe, he was involved with both of them, is very, very similar. London was the epicenter of arms dealing to countries like Iran and Iraq, and was the epicenter of money laundering, and Hugh was the primary money launderer. And he was the primary money launderer for Robert Maxwell, amongst others. Epstein was introduced to a British arms dealer who introduced him to Robert Maxwell, who introduced him in the late 80s to Ghislaine. And that's where the sexual deviancy started, in London, between Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell in the late 80s. And then they transferred back to New York. But when he came back to New York, he didn't just bring back the political blackmail tactics he'd learned with Ari Ben-Menashe. He continued with the arms dealing and the money laundering. And that's recorded in a number of books. I didn't know about it until a few years ago. And it opens a whole new chapter in the influence of Epstein. Another chapter came to my attention a couple of weeks ago when I read that in a left-wing journal, which sometimes I check them out very carefully. Its investigative techniques were top-notch, absolutely solid, lots of documentation. Epstein was responsible with Ehud Barak, who appears in the whole Geoffrey story, for negotiating a security agreement between Mongolia and Israel. So what? Israel is looking for friends. It's always looking for friends. My Israeli intelligence informant, who's in the book Maggie's Hammer, told me that after the 80s, he had been involved in Azerbaijan, negotiating a security arrangement, in Zimbabwe, and negotiating with the primary Libyan militia after Gaddafi left. Israel was looking for friends everywhere. Epstein, this financier from New York, who, although important in New York and a sexual deviant, what's he doing organizing a security agreement between Israel and Mongolia? The answer, starting in the 80s, Epstein was a far more powerful sticker behind the scenes than just the sexual deviancy. And that's the connection with Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew, in his military intelligence and Freemasonic connections, was also an official trade representative for Great Britain in the 90s and the noughts. And the primary trade that Great Britain now engages in is arms deals. So the relationship between Epstein and Andrew was much more than just sexual deviancy. I'm going to pause there in case you have a question.
Yeah.
Because I'm then going to lead on to the sociopathy.
So the sexual deviancy aspect, and everyone is focusing on that, and it is horrendous, and it deserves, and the victims and so forth, it deserves a great deal of attention.
Absolutely.
It's been sort of couched as a honey trap operation, or was that sexual deviancy that Prince Andrew got involved in, was that perhaps maybe one of the benefits of being in Epstein's circle, that you would have access to these young women, or was it in fact a blackmail operation? Was Prince Andrew being blackmailed?
Neither. It wasn't blackmail. It wasn't a benefit, and I'll come to this. It was willing partners. And this is the story that most people are missing. I'm going to take a step back because I've been reading Geoffrey's book, and it's appalling. And one of the things I think that we haven't understood, maybe it's been a deliberate PR tactic, although it's horrible to talk in those terms about someone who was so badly treated, and that's not a strong enough description. One of the things that they've missed is the element of abuse and emotional void and sociopathy and vulnerability that comes out of that sort of background. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about psychology, but I myself am a recovering alcoholic. I've done a lot of therapy. I've met with people who've been abused. I wasn't abused, but my parents were what they call absent. My mother was an alcoholic. My father was always absent. And that creates an emotional void. Now, on a spectrum, you can go from slightly absent parents all the way to sexually abusive parents, as in the case of Geoffrey. And the void is filled in a number of different ways. Sometimes you can just fill it. In my case, I like going to the cinema a lot. If you've been abused, it's filled with sociopathy and sexual abuse. In the case of Geoffrey, she was terribly badly abused by her father and friends of her father. That's in the book, and it never stopped. Why did she keep going back to it? One of the problems with people who are sexually abused is it's the only love they know, and they are continually attracted back to people who abuse them. Why would they abuse them? The abusers are themselves abused. We talk about the cycle of abuse. I began to look at Epstein. Epstein grew up, he didn't come from a good family. He came from a bad family. He was badly treated. And he developed, but he was very intelligent, and he traded that. And that developed a form of sociopathy. Well, what about Prince Andrew? Nothing wrong there. Andrew was a second son. He was always the invisible person in the room. That develops its own emotional void. Add this to that, the fact that royalty and nobility and aristocracy and the upper class in Great Britain, think Downton Abbey, but the dark version. They have country weekends. And I know this because I've studied it, because I had discovered that I talked about the dark networks that overlap. Sexual deviancy kept on appearing. And I believed, like you, that maybe it was blackmail, or maybe it was, you've had a hard day at the office. I don't mean to diminish this, but you've had a hard day at the office. You go home to your sexual deviant network, and no, and they go hand in hand. The forces that drive you into sexual deviancy are the forces that drive you into sociopathy and arms dealing and trying to break the world. They are combined. So Andrew comes from a background where he goes to country weekends, and aristocratic families are literally trafficking their children to royalty. Diana was trafficked to Charles at the age of 16. That's what happened. So Andrew is used to this. Andrew goes out into the wig-wide world because his mother insisted upon it. He comes across Epstein in London when he came to London, and he started going to parties in London. And Epstein and he are like hand in glove. Epstein's got money, and which Andrew needed. He's clever, which Andrew wasn't. Andrew is as dim as a turned-off light bulb. They both liked women, and they both liked young women. They were willing partners with each other. And then Epstein would provide Andrew with money and Fergie with money. And I've read excerpts from the Andrew Lowney book. And this is absolutely typical. I met Andrew once. I met him in Harrods in the 80s. Really charming. He was in his 20s. Charming guy, lovely, dim as a bulb. Really. Not very clever at all, but really, really charming. And he saw nothing wrong with what he was doing. The age of consent in Great Britain is 16. You think, yes, but, is it just a political favour? Is it blackmail? No, it's a willing partner. It was two very broken people recognizing broken girls and manipulating them. And I'm going to say something, Richard. We need to stop normalizing the language. Trafficking. It sounds like an old woman crossing the road. It's not. These were sociopaths, predators who recognized what they were getting in Geoffrey and didn't think twice about it. And then the same people, when they're finished, go off into another room and navigate and negotiate arms deals and money laundering, and what they're going to do about this security arrangement and what they're going to do with the Israelis. The same people involved in sexual deviancy and the same forces are the people who are involved in breaking our world. And they are not, one is not subordinate to the other. They go hand in hand.
Sarah Ferguson, you mentioned.
Yes.
She wrote an email calling Epstein a supreme friend, and now, of course, she's been dropped by multiple charities. What does that tell us about the leverage Epstein held over royal figures?
Well, there was this, as I said, there's this willing partnership. He brought money, intelligence, and access. They brought their own networks, masonry, intelligence, the British Empire. And Epstein, although he appeared supremely confident, my read of the situation, he was supremely insecure. He was able to use his intelligence to get himself into circles, but he always felt insecure. He brought money, but that's all. He spent a lot of time currying favor with academics because he was intelligent, but he had no college degree. So he wanted to surround himself with academics and finance them. Same with the royals. He wanted to surround himself with royals, but specifically in the case of Prince Andrew, he recognized someone who was involved in the same sort of secret arms dealing and intelligence networks, and somebody who was just as much a sexual deviant. I don't know whether Sarah was involved in that or not. I honestly do not know. But the problem was that Sarah did not get a good settlement from the divorce from Andrew. Diana got a good one. Sarah got maybe a few $100,000. Now, a few $100,000 to you and me is a lot of money, but it wasn't to her. It wasn't to Andrew. Andrew's annual bill is for living is about $3 million. He gets nothing close to that. He has to get it from people like Epstein. And there was this natural symbiosis with Epstein. And for a couple of decades, Epstein was happy to finance both Sarah Ferguson and Andrew. Then Sarah got herself in a mess. In 2011, Epstein had been convicted of trafficking, and she wanted to have nothing to do with it. So she had to say she had to go. I think she was in an interview, and she had to say, "I am completely against this in pedophilia. I have nothing to do with it. I've cut off all ties with Epstein." Epstein turned around and says, "Well, screw you. I'm going to sue you." And she has to come back and say, "No. I was just saying that for the press. Please don't cut off the money. You've been my supreme friend." On the one hand, I almost feel sorry for her. Then again, I don't. But that's what was going on there.
There are rumors that King Charles is actually near death. His health decline is accelerating.
Yes.
What does the shift in generational power mean in terms of who's really steering the ship behind the throne?
That's a really interesting question. First of all, my information is that Charles is very unwell. As far as the general public is concerned, when you see it appearing with such regularity in everything from the New York Times to tabloids, don't denigrate tabloids. Think Men in Black 1. That's where they get the information. I've been told by 2 different intelligence agencies that they literally use tabloids to get out stories they know are going to come up and they want to discredit. When you've got that much information, it's probably true. He is going through chemotherapy at the moment. I don't think he's going to make it more than a couple of years. When he dies, he would have performed a really useful function just for those people who are royal followers. No one was sure what was going to happen when Elizabeth died. She'd been queen for more than 60 years. I didn't know any other monarch. I was upset when she died. Charles, at the age of 70, did a fantastic job of giving the British public a soft landing into a new monarchy, and he really has done a fantastic job. He has been more relaxed and personable, perhaps, than Elizabeth. What he's also done is a fabulous job of training up William, who will be completely ready, quite a young monarch by past standards, who will be completely ready to take over. But I think the question you're asking is, how is this going to impact all of the networks? And to be honest, I don't know. It's kind of like John Paul I, who said he was going to undo all of the um, corruption at the heart of the Vatican, and turns up dead 33 days later. I think William is savvy enough to know that he is going to be at the apex of different networks that cannot be completely undone and ignored. But I think that what you will find is a very fresh attitude towards the royalty, towards the way he raises his children, and towards these networks privately. I don't think he's going to be as subservient to them or as in partnership with them as the existing royals have been.
So, again, the successor dynamics. King Charles is weakening, Prince William's being groomed. Obviously, I mean that in the non-sexual manner, but
No.
who in the background is influencing that ascension? I mean, how might the allied networks you've been talking about be positioning themselves for the next royal pivot?
Well, it's very interesting. I have been trying to pay close attention to that. And for example, with Charles, one of his alternative sources of advice was Lord Mountbatten. Philip also got advice from Lord Mountbatten. Charles is helping William, but I was looking around to see who is giving him advice. Is there some outside influence? And this is the interesting thing, and it took me a while to settle on it. His greatest advisor, aside from his father, is Prince Edward. Now, Prince Edward, and particularly his wife, the Countess of Wessex, Sophie, they're not well known. They very much have kept to the background. There's not any scandal associated with them. They pretty much keep to charity. But Edward has been out. He's a great theatre goer. He's an actor as well. Edward has his head and pretty much screwed on. So is Sophie. And when they were beginning with Diana, Sophie kept on inserting herself in royal circles as the sensible advisor on PR. And I would think you would see Prince Edward coming to the fore as and when Charles dies. Beyond that, I get no sense of anybody outside of the royal family having a great deal of influence with William.
So do you see the monarchy as functioning as is it a front, is it a conduit, or is it a shield for those networks you've been talking about?
It's a major player. Absolutely, it is a major player. It is easy to think that it's just decorative, but no, it's not. Through its money, its lands, its influence in the empire. Remember, the British monarch is still the head of something called the Commonwealth, which is about 100 countries, former colonies. For a while in the 70s and the 80s, there was an attempt to diminish its influence. That has changed. And when Queen Elizabeth died, one of the first things to happen was that the Commonwealth met and of its own volition chose Charles to be the new head of the Commonwealth. It wasn't automatic. They could have chosen a president from another country. They could have chosen, I don't think he was still alive, Nelson Mandela, say, for example, but they didn't. They chose Charles. That's very indicative of how powerful the royal family still is. So it's not a decoration, it's not attendant, it's not being blackmailed. The royal family is very much, through all of its different networks at various levels, a huge player in the world. And coming full circle, that's why it's so important with Epstein.
I remember back in I guess maybe the 90s, there was a book that was published by the Executive Intelligence Review. This was Lyndon LaRouche's outfit, called Dope Inc., which detailed in incredible, I mean, this was like 500, 600 pages, this book, as I recall, the British royal family's involvement in drug dealing.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
I didn't read it, but I didn't particularly much care for LaRouche personally, but in the course of my own research for Maggie's Hammer, I used Executive Intelligence Review assiduously because its investigations are very good. They get a lot of information. I actually never bothered to look into that because it didn't directly connect with what I was doing. But if you're asking me my opinion would be, if that is something that interests a listener or reviewer, go and read it. Because I mentioned earlier some of the left-wing journals that I read. I make sure that their investigation techniques are solid. And the investigation techniques of executive intelligence review are totally solid. I looked more at their stuff on arms dealing than I did with drug trafficking. But it's back to the royal family, the City of London, the empire, drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms dealing. They are all part of the powerful networks that finance what's going on behind the scenes. And it's, Richard, again, unfortunate isn't a strong enough word. It's horrific that these are the ways that people make money, and the people who make that money have that much power, but it's true. So I wouldn't doubt it.
When people say this is the last, Prince William will be the last king, the monarchy will not survive, it almost sounds like, based on what you're saying, is it can't fail.
Absolutely. There was a time in the 70s, again, for the sake of your listeners and your viewers, in the 70s, in the late 60s, early 70s, Great Britain had a Labour Party government, as they do at the moment. The Labour Party government back in the 60s and the 70s was very radical. It started off kind of like Tony Blair, just as a sort of a gentle left-wing alternative to the Conservatives. But then within the party, and this has always been the case for the Labour Party, sort of like the Democratic Party, the people who control the Democratic Party, the people who control the Labour Party are not the moderate people fronting it. They're the left-wingers behind it. And the left-wingers in the 60s and the 70s took control of the Labour government. And the Labour government, certainly in the 70s, was very close to being communist. They had a manifesto in 1976 called Labour Party Programme. It was that manifesto that persuaded me to join with Margaret Thatcher, because I was so terrified of the picture it painted of a Great Britain completely run and controlled by a socialist government. In that atmosphere, there were a lot of moves to denigrate and remove the monarchy. They continued into the 80s. Elizabeth had to run all sorts of PR campaigns to try and stop it. By the time we got to, say, the London Olympics in 2012, all of those moves had stopped. There were well-known left-wingers in the British Labour Party who joked and said, "We lost that." I mean, they said, you won't find a socialist in Great Britain who's not also a royalist. We're past that. And that is also because of the networks and the power that they have. No, William has 2 sons and a daughter, and it will be King George after him, and it will continue.
I was reading where we were talking about Virginia Giuffre, who was suicided, or actually committed suicide, and wrote this book. We're hearing from her now from the grave.
Yes.
I believe her is it her lawyer who is talking about subpoenaing Meghan Markle in some sort of case?
Yes. Okay. Now this one, Richard, is a bit of a distraction. Meghan Markle's very cute, and she knows what she wants. She's kind of like a Diana. She knew what she wanted, and she got her Harry. Meghan Markle would walk to the end of the pier and off of it if it got a talking fee or a speaking fee. Bless her heart. I've learned that expression since I've been in America. I have no doubt that somebody would have subpoenaed her. If I was an attorney fighting for Geoffrey, I would have done the same thing.
Why?
First of all, because it would get press attention. If I was Geoffrey's attorney, I would be saying to myself, and I know she's dead, and that's tragic. Everyone's heard the story. No one's interested. You can only pile on so much misery. Well, people, please read the book. After you've read my book, read her book, because we need to understand that the abuse that she suffered and the vulnerability it creates, married with people who are abused and become sociopaths, that's running and breaking the world. However, if I was her attorney and she was still alive, I would be saying people are sick and tired of the story. But if I put Meghan Markle in the stand, people will pay attention. What could Meghan Markle bring? Well, she would be happy to have the limelight, and she would talk about meeting Andrew, and she would talk about Balmoral and Sandringham. But there is no evidence that I can find that she knew Epstein or had anything to do with it. There's no evidence that I can find that she had anything new to say about Epstein, Giuffre, and Andrew. But I'm absolutely certain she would have taken the opportunity to respond to the subpoena for our own reasons, and the attorney would have been happy to have it. But I think it's a bit of a red herring.
So you've drawn these straight lines from Epstein to Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, from the monarchy to we talked some time ago about the Alaska summit, the Russia-Ukraine war, and
Yes.
you're arguing we're seeing the same hand that's writing different scripts. So what should the public be watching right now that indicates which script is unfolding next?
Well, here's the thing. And the first thing you should do, Richard, as far as your listeners and viewers are concerned, is watch the Richard Syrett show, because he's got his finger on the pulse. The second thing is we have this wonderful thing called artificial intelligence. If you write the right prompt, they will come back and help you. Sometimes they won't. But I've said this before and I'll say it again. Strange things go on around all of us. But whenever you look at an expose, like my book, my friend turned up dead in the woods. I lived in a town of 20,000 people to the west of London. Not important. I wasn't all that important. My friend and I, we read speeches for Margaret Thatcher. We were on our way in politics, but we were nothing special. Then he turns up dead in the woods. I start asking the right questions in the wrong places. I'm on a roller coaster. 30 years later, I'm on your show talking about networks. I didn't go looking for them, but I found them. If something weird happens near you, don't leave it to somebody else to investigate. Ask questions, find out, use artificial intelligence, look a little bit deeper. And if you see names or circumstances that marry something else, push a little bit harder. Now, I'm not saying go and invade people's dustbins, because that's intrusive, but keep your eyes and your ears open, because all of these people, the Freemasons, they all have to go home in the evening to a house, and that house might be next door to yours. You never know what's going on next door. But keep your eyes and your ears open. And think about, now let's just take this one, let's talk about Putin. Well, yeah, okay, Putin's president of Russia. He's a dictator. He's nasty. KGB. Well, he was in the KGB in Eastern Europe. He saw the wall came down. He was surrounded by all these chivalric orders and things gone. He knows a lot. He knows what's behind the power systems in Europe. He knows what he's up against in Ukraine. Well, in Ukraine, he's just up against Zelensky. No, he's not. Donald Trump's director of counterterrorism is a guy called Sebastian Gorka. He was in Trump's first administration. Very senior position. He is a Hungarian citizen who is also an American citizen now, but his primary fealty is to Hungary, and he is a senior official in a chivalric order in Ukraine. I think it's called something like the Order of Vilnius. How do I know this? Because I go looking. Why is it important? Go and read Maggie's Hammer. You will find why these organizations are important. Ukraine is about matters that have gone back hundreds of years, and Putin knows about this. What else about Putin? Putin was in the KGB, and after the Soviet Union collapsed, the two organizations that were still organized were the black market, were the Russian mafia, and the KGB. Putin got involved in asset stripping along with all his oligarch friends, the KGB, and he used the Russian mafia, specifically the head of the Russian mob called Semen Moyedovich. Semen Moyedovich, in my book, was also involved with Robert Maxwell, laundering money from arms deals into Eastern Europe, not out of it. There's a connection. Putin has $70 billion squirreled away overseas. He tried to influence the 2016 elections, not just Trump, everyone, including Hillary Clinton, because he was trying to get American politicians to agree to repeal the legislation that was going to freeze his assets. One of the last outliers, one of the last outflows of money from Russia ended up in New York in March of 2017, just after Donald Trump had become president. There was going to be a judgment in a trial in New York about that outflow of money. The trial was stopped, and the U.S. attorney, Preet Bharara, which is a name some people may recognize, was fired as U.S. attorney because it was about to expose Putin's connection to money laundering, which was itself connected to arms dealing, which went all the way back to the 80s when the Soviet Union began to break up. All of this is connected. All you have to do, even as an ordinary listener or viewer, is follow the trail.
Maggie's Hammer. How do we get a copy?
You can Google Maggie's Hammer. It's Maggies, Hammer. My name is Geoff Gilson. It's spelled with a Geoff. Google Maggie's Hammer, Geoff Gilson. You'll find the book. If you want updates on what's going on, as I say again, watch Richard Syrett, because I love coming on his show. But also go to my Facebook page, which is under Geoff Gilson. You can see my face. You'll recognize it when you see it. Google that. You'll find it.
Always a pleasure, Geoff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.